All right, this is the final DC Dual Force faction review. Last but certainly not least is the Might faction. Again, I have already covered every single other faction in the game. I'll link my playlist for all of my faction reviews in the description if you have not seen your favorite faction just yet. I have already posted the video. Let's not waste any time and jump straight into the leaders. Normally I go in order of defense value, but we're going to leave Aquaman for last because he's a little more complicated than the other two leaders. Let's start with Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman is a 21 defense leader with a 2-cost effect, and a very good one. Wonder Woman gets +4 attack this turn and give your recruits +1 armor. It can't be understated just how powerful this effect is. Sure, it's not a super flashy effect that you can build your entire deck around, but do not underestimate just how strong this effect is. It is a very cheap effect. You can use this every 2 turns. The attack generated is incredibly high. 4 attack is a ton of attack. It can clear almost, keyword being almost, every single bronze creature in the game, or every single bronze recruit. Again, there are exceptions to that. Anything with shield can't be cleared. Prometheus and Ivy's Flytrap can't be cleared, but the vast majority of bronze units will die to this effect. It's not to mention any other bonus attack value you somehow give to Wonder Woman. And in addition to that, she's giving your recruits +1 armor, or +1 defense, I should say. 1 defense can make the difference between a creature, or a recruit, I should say, living or dying, and that's going to be very important for some of the recruits we go over in today's Might faction review, but that also goes for the recruits in the other factions that we've already gone over, and this is just secondary. Really, the best part about Wonder Woman's effect is that she gets +4 attack, which is kind of a crazy number for such a cheap effect. I've decided to add this segment in post because I've actually changed my mind on Superman. At first, I wasn't convinced he was that good. Let's first read the card. He's a 22 defense leader with a 3-cost effect. His effect reads, Superman gets +7 attack this turn and invincible. Now, I wasn't initially convinced by this card because 3 cost is so much more than 2 cost. It's hard to illustrate just how big of a jump that is. If we assume, for example, the game's going to go 8 turns, it will sometimes go longer than that. It will sometimes go shorter than that. But let's just say, for example, the game's going to go 8 turns. A 2-cost effect can be triggered 4 times during that window. However, a 3-cost effect can only be triggered twice. Once you make that jump to a 3-cost ability, assuming that we're going to 8 turns, you've halved the number of times that you're able to activate that ability. With that said, 7 attack is strong enough to kill every single bronze card in the game. It's strong enough to kill a good percentage of silver cards, not all of them, but a very high percentage of them. And Superman's also invincible during the activation, so effectively against most units, again, there are exceptions to this, units with shield and things like that, Superman essentially has a 3-cost ability that reads KO an enemy recruit. Again, it's not that simple because he doesn't have Hunter and he doesn't have a way of getting access to cards that are otherwise blocked. But when you view it from this lens that it's effectively kill an enemy recruit, at least a lot of the time it is, then it's much easier to forgive Superman for that 3-cost effect. Also, the Might faction offers a handful of charge ramp effects, and Superman has access to one of those civilian cards, one of those cards that charge up your leader based on the leader that you have. The card is Lois Lane, and we'll talk about that later when we get to it. And it's quite a good card, and for that reason, I do think Superman is a much better card than I initially thought he was. All right, last but certainly not least is Aquaman. I am absolutely in love with Aquaman. He might be my favorite leader in the game. He's a 20 defense leader and a 3-cost effect, so again, on the expensive side of effects. Aquaman gets +3 attack, so a decent amount of attack. At least it's not 2, you know. Summon a sea creature, then give your friendly sea creatures everywhere +1/+1. So there's a few different ways to generate sea creatures. Here's what they do. We've got a humpback whale, a narwhal, a squid, Storm the seahorse, a giant anglerfish, and a great white shark. The humpback whale is a 2/7, so he's nice and tanky. If we assume that we're generating each of these for the first time with Aquaman's effect, you can essentially interpret all of these as +1/+1. So humpback whale is essentially a 3/8, narwhal is essentially a 7/2 with aura. Aura is a very important keyword for something that has such a low defense value. It means it's protected from, pings and other spot damage effects. Squid is a 4/2, effectively a 5/3, with deploy, exhaust a random enemy recruit. Storm Seahorse is a 0/4, again, effectively a 1/5. Your Aquaman leader is invincible and has +3 attack. That is a super strong effect because you're already generating 3 attack from Aquaman's effect when you summon this, and then Storm would essentially make this as strong as a Superman activation because your Aquaman would go to 6 attack, and he also has invincible. So yeah, I think you're going to be very happy when you land on Storm the Seahorse. Giant Anglerfish reads End, give your recruits with 5 or more attack +1/+1. Again, you can interpret this essentially as a 4/4. And then Great White Shark is, again, essentially a 5/5. And the reason I say essentially these cards are +1/+1 than what you initially see them as, is because almost all of the time, again, with some exceptions, like if someone plays Hugo Strange against you or something like that, your very first sea creature is going to be generated through Aquaman's effect. The other two generations of sea creatures that are in the game, one of them is a silver card and the other one is a gold card. It is technically possible to play a silver card before you use your Aquaman's effect, but on average, Aquaman will be your first instance of summoning a sea creature. I really like Aquaman because he has kind of this infinitely scaling effect. You know, let's say I use Aquaman effects 3 times throughout the game. Each of my sea creatures would all have +3/+3, and that's pretty fun. Aquaman's going to be a looming threat over the opponent at all times. The opponent's going to have to deal with Aquaman as quickly as possible, because if they don't, he's going to get completely out of hand, and the longer the game goes, the more happy Aquaman is to be there. All right, let's move on to the actual Might cards now. Might has 2 free cards. Let's start off with Thanagarian Mace. Thanagarian Mace is a buff card. There's a handful of buff cards we'll talk about as we progress throughout this video, and a handful of cards that care about receiving buffs. Again, we'll mention those as we get there. A 2/1 buff is pretty good, especially for a free effect, and especially in a faction that cares about buff cards. I think Thanagarian Mace is going to be quite strong. Expect to see a lot of it. Jimmy Olsen is a 0/2 with a shield. This faction does care about having shield. We'll see other shield matters effects as we continue. So there's a little bit of extra weight added to Jimmy Olsen. With that said, I'm not particularly impressed with him so far. A 0/2 with shield isn't quote-unquote bad, and there are certainly things you want to protect within the Might faction. So you would play something on the back row that you want protected. You would play Jimmy Olsen in front of it, and now the odds of that card being destroyed, the card you're trying to protect, are decreased. And that'll be the main use case for Jimmy Olsen. There are definitely factions that are better than others at destroying things that are otherwise protected. So Jimmy Olsen's certainly not going to guaranteed protect something on the back row, and for that reason, I'm a bit skeptical about how strong he is. But honestly, I think a lot of people are going to look at Jimmy Olsen and immediately write him off, but I definitely don't think we should be doing that. He definitely has some potential. A card with substantially more potential is Steve Trevor. I think this card is one of the best cards in the game. This card seems insane to me. Steve Trevor is a 2/3, so he's got, I would say, above average stats. Again, I believe defense values are better than attack values in this game, so having 3 defense on a bronze card is very good. And on top of that, he has probably one of the most important effects in the game. He reads deploy, charge a friendly leader. Again, we just talked about how important charge is. In games where it would only go to 7 turns, Wonder Woman would only activate her ability 3 times, but with Steve Trevor, she now activates her ability 4 times. Pushing cards over the edge and getting an extra activation in a game where you otherwise wouldn't be able to is a big deal. Even if you don't increase the number of activations you get throughout the game as a result of Steve Trevor's effect, just getting to use them sooner can be a big deal. Just look at Steve Trevor and Aquaman, for example. Getting to play a sea creature a turn early is a gigantic deal, especially because that activation, that summon effect you're getting from Aquaman, isn't one of the resources you're using for that turn. So you can develop a lot of power in a single turn, or a lot of stats in a single turn, just because of Steve Trevor. Steve Trevor is a massive threat, and I expect to see him see a ton of play. Antiope is a 3/3 with Aura. Aura is a great effect. 3/3 is really good stats for a bronze card. There are other cards in other factions that care about you having Aura. The first one that comes to mind is an energy faction card called Mary Bromfield. She buffs friendly Aura cards by +2/+2, so there's certainly some synergy there. Might not even need to go that deep though. 3/3 with Aura is just good. If you're looking for a decent statted bronze card to add to your lineup, Antiope is probably the way to go. But she's got some good competition. There are some Might cards with some really good stats. Speaking of that, we have Themysciran Minotaur, who is a vanilla card with 3/4. 3/4 is some of the best stats we've seen on a bronze card. He's in the Anarchy faction and he attacks randomly. So that card comes with a big downside. It also has a plus side with a potential +3 attack with Adrenaline. So that's a little bit of a different scenario, but this card is probably very consistent. It also is worth mentioning that we're talking about Themysciran Minotaur in a faction that has access to a ton of buff cards. So even just looking at Thanagarian Mace, which was the first card we talked about in this video, if we played that on Minotaur, he's a 5/5 for a bronze card, and that's going to be really early stats, going to help you swing board advantages. I'm not convinced he's like this crazy powerful card or anything like that, but you certainly shouldn't scoff at stats like this. Next up is Warlord, a pretty interesting card. He's a 5/1. 5 is obviously a ton of stats for a bronze card, but the reason this is important is there's a bunch of different cards in the game that care about you having 5 attack. We went over one of them earlier when we were talking about the sea creatures. The giant anglerfish refers to giving your recruits with +5 attack, or 5 attack or more, I should say, +1/+1. Warlord hits that barrier, or hits that condition in the bronze cost, which aren't going to be very many bronze cards that hit the 5 cost threshold, or the 5 attack threshold. And obviously that's worth keeping in mind for potential Might Tyranny decks, because Tyranny has access to Black Adam, who's another card that specifically cares about you playing 5 attack cards. Is Warlord enough to justify the Tyranny Might synergy? It just might be, especially if you're going to be running Aquaman as one of your leaders. Wildcat is a 3/3 who reads deploy, give another friendly recruit +1/+1. The stats on Wildcat are great. He's essentially a 4/4. The only problem I have here is that it is a buff effect, right? But the problem is it's not coming from an action. And some of the buff cards that we care about throughout the Might faction specifically refer to receiving buffs from an action. So Wildcat won't have synergy with those cards. I will mention those as they get brought up. So that's a limiting factor of Wildcat, but his effect is quite strong. There's a lot of competition for really good statted bronze cards in the Might faction between Antiope, Wildcat, and Thanagarian Minotaur, and I don't know which ones are going to end up making the cut in the end, but they're all quite fantastic. Ma and Pa Kent, this is a super interesting card for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a 0/2, so it has no attack value, but it reads, and give your leaders +2 defense. This is a super strong effect, not only because it can happen multiple times, but this is not healing. Ma and Pa Kent can increase your maximum defense on your leaders. So if you're running a control or ramp strategy, playing Ma and Pa Kent as a defensive strategy, and then maybe putting something in front of it, like a Chibi Olsen that we went over earlier, or an otherwise defensive creature, Ma and Pa Kent could live for multiple turns, effectively delaying the game for significantly longer than otherwise possible. I haven't done any science with Ma and Pa Kent on Tabletop Simulator, but my assumption is that it's quite decent. A lot of defensive strategies in this type of card game, because this card game is so tempo oriented and honestly has the potential for being quite aggro dominant, cards like this are going to make or break control strategies, because there's kind of like this upper limit where control strategies are trying to just get over this hill, and once they're over this hill and they've maintained control of the game, a different phase of the game starts where they have complete control and the opponent's just trying to eke out a little bit of damage and hopefully close out the game, but really that control player has fully established themselves as the winning player. It's just a matter of time until they take out that win. Now, entering that phase of the game can be difficult just because of how important tempo is in this game, and Ma and Pa Kent might help you get over that hump, get over that hill, and enter the second phase. So yeah, very important card to keep in mind as we evaluate the kind of more control-y or perhaps even ramp strategies for Might. I brought up ramp because the next card is Blue Devil. Blue Devil is a 3/1 who reads start, generate a silver resource, and lose this ability. So this effect will only resolve once. It will never resolve twice. But if you get off this effect, you have a huge tempo swing. If you build your deck primarily around the silver and gold cost cards, Blue Devil will help you get out cards a little bit sooner than you would otherwise be able to, and that's super important because silver cards have such better stats than bronze cards. This effect is another example of trying to get over that hump that we were talking about for these kind of slower decks. If you play Blue Devil on turn 1, and then on turn 2 you have the ability to play a silver card, and then obviously you're naturally able to play a silver card on turn 3, it lets you get away with running a much higher ratio of silver and gold cards than you would normally in a deck. Also, Blue Devil doesn't need to just come down on turn 1. If we play Blue Devil on turn 2, it lets us play 2 silver cards on turn 3 as opposed to the 1 that we would normally be limited to, and while that is significantly worse than playing Blue Devil on turn 1 and then ramping into a silver card on turn 2, it is still very effective at maintaining, or not maintaining, but I guess capturing board control that you're otherwise probably going to have to sacrifice in the early game if you're playing one of these rampy control style decks. Moving on to Clark Kent, he's a 1/1 with the effect start, transform Clark Kent into Superman and exhaust him. What is Superman? This is Superman. Check this out. This is an 8/8 with shield. If Clark Kent survives a turn, you get an 8/8 on turn 2. Now, I have 2 cautionary tales for this, because when people first see this, they freak out and they think that this is like the strongest card in the game, but there's 2 big concerns I have for Clark Kent. One is that he's extraordinarily vulnerable. 1 defense is obviously super vulnerable. We just went over tactics yesterday, so like batarang is like a way to just deal with deal with Clark Kent without having to pay anything. So you might develop a bronze resource and then effectively lose it. And then there's obviously a ton of ping effects over the game that we've gone over all of the factions now, so I'm sure you're familiar with it a little bit. There's effects like speed, there's ventriloquist, there's Joker, there's shoot randomly, there's all kinds of these effects that can easily kill off Clark Kent without even having to trade into him with another card. But if we assume we get off this transformation effect, it's going to be super, super dominant. He does come into play exhausted, but in the early parts of the game, like before people get access to gold effects, there's actually very few cards that read KO a recruit or just destroy a recruit. So Superman's going to be in a pretty solid spot. Don't get me wrong, there are options to deal with him in the early game, but they're pretty few and far between. So some of those options include like Straight Jacket from the Tactics faction, The Bigger They Are from the Anarchy faction, but for the most part, the factions in the game are going to have a pretty hard time of dealing with an 8/8 with shield on turn 2 or even turn 3, which is really when they have to deal with this. The earliest that they have to deal with this is turn 3 because Clark would come down on turn 1. On turn 2, the Superman that he generates would be exhausted. So really, Superman doesn't have any impact on the game until turn 3. I mean, obviously he can act as like a blocker or something like that, but I would imagine on average, Superman's going to end up on the back row because you're going to want to play Clark Kent on the back row to kind of protect him, and then Superman will be transformed in that location. So, sorry, that was a long conversation about Clark Kent, but I think he's warranting of that conversation. Flex Mentallo is up next. Flex Mentallo is a 2/3. The first time Flex increases during your turn, increases his attack value to be specific. Create a bronze action in your hand. I assume that this bronze action can be cross-faction, so it won't just be might faction cards. It can be, tyranny or whatever. At least that's my assumption. Regardless, though, I don't think this effect is too strong. There's not actually a ton of ways to increase your attack value specifically. Obviously, there are effects like Wildcat that we just went over, the Thanagarian Mace, but some of the buff cards you're going to want to use in this kind of buff archetype are defense exclusive, and some of those buffs also happen while the card's in your hand or in your deck. And if that's the case, Flex isn't going to be able to generate a card because he wasn't on the board to see the buff happen. So honestly, I'm not super high on Flex, but it's a cool card. It's an interesting way to get access to other factions' cards, but obviously it's not. It doesn't appear to be super consistent to me. But if you want some consistent cards, I've got one for you, and it's Superman Robot. Man, this card is crazy. It's a 2/2, so that's fine stats, nothing crazy, but his effect is crazy. He has shield and guard. Oh my, this is super disruptive to aggressive strategies. If you feel like you're going to be running into a lot of aggressive strategies, just chuck Superman Robot in your deck and you should be fine. It's going to take them multiple turns, multiple cards, multiple actions to deal with this Superman Robot. I'm really high on Superman Robot. I would still expect this card to see a ton of play if it was a 2/1, maybe even if it was a 1/1. Yeah, this is a pretty strong card. I'll be running a ton of this in my more defensive strategies and even in my mid-range strategies and probably even in my aggressive strategies if they involve the Might faction. It's just, yeah, super solid card. A staple to the Might faction. Krypto is a really fun card. He's got shield, deploy, give another friendly character shield. Yeah, really solid effect. The main application of this is probably going to be reapplying shield to a card that already has shield. Probably wouldn't run Krypto in a non-shield deck. So as a result of that, most of the cards in your deck are going to be shield relevant cards, and if that's the case, the only applicable use is reapplying shield. But yeah, I think that'll be the case. Up and away, give your recruits with shield +4 attack this turn. I'm honestly not in love with this card. This card seems like it should be really good, and perhaps it is really good. Maybe I'm undervaluing it, but my first interpretation is it's not great. The reason for it is, A, the card actively needs shield. If it's lost shield, this won't give the card +4 attack. But on top of that, I don't think shield decks are really going to have a problem with closing out games, and up and away seems like a finisher to me. Sure, you could use it as advantageous trades. After all, your card is already protected because it has shield. If it's receiving this buff, it has shield. So you can just give all of your cards with shield +4 attack and then take the best trades possible. But I don't think the shield cards are going to have problems with taking trades. They all have really good stats, with obviously the exception of Krypto, which we just went over. So honestly, I don't really see a use case for this card. I think in a lot of cases, you're going to draw this card and you won't be in an applicable situation and you would have rather have drawn a better recruit or something like that. Yeah, my first impressions of up and away aren't positive. Maybe you run it as like a one-of to try and do like surprise finishes in certain situations, and that way it doesn't brick your hand as often as I think it will. But maybe I'm an absolute hater and I'm misjudging this card, and we just run 2 copies of it anyway because it's so strong. Obviously, it can completely blow out games, so I might just be completely wrong and it's going to be super strong. Who knows? Bibbo is up next, and he is a 2/2 with guard, so decent. Deploy, if you have a recruit with shield, draw a card. I mean, yeah, this just seems good. The only problem with this, again, is, of course, if the character loses shield, you won't get the draw card. So if I play Superman Robot on 2, the opponent destroys the shield. I can't play Bibbo on 3 because I won't get the draw card effect. But in that situation, it's fine because I've probably got a silver card with shield that I can play anyway, but Bibbo would have to be the second card I play that turn. Rather than the first. And ideally, you want Bibbo to be the first card that you play, so you get the draw card and you have more options for your second card that you play that turn. Yeah, honestly, I like Bibbo quite a lot. Something I haven't mentioned in any of these videos yet is how important it is when a bronze card reads draw a card, because you can use it as your first action of the turn without using up your most valuable resource. If it's turn 3 and you've got a silver and a bronze resource, playing a bronze card that lets you draw a card first increases your options for potential silver card, where if it was a silver card that draws you a card, the card that you draw has a lower chance of being an option that you can play that turn because you only have a bronze resource available. Moving on to Lois Lane, she's a 1/1. I love these civilian style cards. I think they're really interesting. She reads, the first time you deploy a recruit with shield each turn, draw a card and charge your Superman. Wow, I think this card is insane, actually. Again, I think charging your leader is super important, and she's drawing cards. You can play this on the same turn that you're going to play a shield recruit, so you can force a card draw out of her the turn that you play her, and then if she lives for another turn because you just played a shield card in front of her, like for example, if we go Lois Lane on the back lane, then Superman Robot in front front of her, the odds of her surviving until the next turn are dramatically increased, and then we can just keep playing more and more shield cards and drawing more and more cards from Lois Lane. I do want to mention that I think Lois Lane's effect is strong enough that you don't necessarily have to be running Superman, but the charge is impactful enough that I think it justifies running Superman over any other leader option. Super Strength is up next, and it reads, give a friendly recruit +3/+3. Really strong buff card. It can be a huge tempo swing, even outside of like buff synergy decks. Like obviously we've talked about some cards that care about being buffed. We already mentioned Flex earlier in this video, and we're about to mention two more once we move into the silver category. Super Strength definitely belongs in that kind of buff archetype, but even outside of the buff archetype, I think this is a fantastic card. Favor of the Gods. Draw a card, then give a random recruit in your hand +2/+2 and guard. There are some fantastic targets for this in the Might faction. We've already gone over some of them. Hitting Blue Devil with this is pretty good to make him a little bit more defensive. Hitting like any of our early game cards. Heck, hitting Jimmy Olsen with this is pretty great. Hitting Superman Robot, even though it already has guard, is good. Hitting Thanagarian Minotaur with this is good. Hitting Antiope with this is good. And hitting some of the more expensive cards that we'll go over later on in this video is also really, really good. Yeah, I like Favor of the Gods a lot. Better Tomorrow reads, give your recruits in your deck +1/+1. So obviously the earlier we play this card, the better, but it also means we're sacrificing quite a bit of tempo. The first 3 turns of the game are so important. Over the course of the first 3 turns, you have the ability to play 5 cards. You have the 1 card on turn 1 for the bronze resource, the 2 cards from the 2 bronze resources on turn 2, and then on turn 3, the 1 silver and the 1 bronze. I think it's very important that we play a card for each of those available 5 possible cards to play. And if you give up one of those play cards to instead play a Better Tomorrow, you're giving up early game tempo. And that's probably not what you want to do in the type of deck that wants to run a Better Tomorrow. The type of deck that wants to give all of their recruits in their deck +1/+1 is probably the type of deck that wants to contribute to an early game tempo, an early game board state. Giving up that tempo might not be worth it. So perhaps in kind of an unintuitive way, this ends up being more of a mid-rangey control card than like an aggressive mid-rangey card. But honestly, I don't think the card's that great. Even though you do get to buff every card in your deck, the issue remains that you give up that early game tempo. And like I said, I think those first 5 card plays of the game, are super important. Amazonian Braces reads, give a friendly character aura and 4 defense. I'm very high on this card. I think this card's great if you get to play this on something very defensive, something with guard maybe. You've essentially put a brick wall in front of your opponent. It's going to be really difficult for them to deal with it, especially because they can't just play KO effects because you've given the card aura, protecting it from any actions or abilities. Moving on to some silver cards. Man, I love the silver cards on offer for the Might faction. Starting with Hawkgirl, she's a 4/4 that reads, after Hawkgirl is affected by a friendly action, draw a card. We've gone over some pretty important actions that the Might faction has to offer. Obviously, Thanagarian Mace is a free one, so you could play turn 3 Hawkgirl, Thanagarian Mace to draw a card, and then if it's a bronze card you draw, you can play that bronze card. So that's a nice little interaction right there. But obviously there's also Super Strength and the Amazonian Braces that we went over. The other buff cards don't apply, like Favor of the Gods and A Better Tomorrow, because neither of them would affect Hawkgirl while she's on the board. So she wouldn't be there to realize that she's been affected by an action, and therefore she wouldn't draw the card off of those effects. Moving on to Hawkman, the same logic applies to him. He's a 4/4, and he reads, after Hawkman is affected by a friendly action, he gets +2/+2. Again, similar to Hawkgirl. Of the cards we've gone over so far, he can only be affected by Thanagarian Mace, Super Strength, and Amazonian Braces. I do want to quickly mention that actions are not abilities. Earlier on in the video, we mentioned Wonder Woman giving your recruits +1. That would not buff Hawkgirl or Hawkman, because that is an ability, not an action. Despite that, I'm pretty high on both Hawkgirl and Hawkman. I think they're really cool cards. I don't know if they're particularly strong, but they're really fun cards, and I hope that they're strong. It's hard for me to gauge how good the kind of buff archetype will be, because honestly, I think the optimized version of that deck is more complicated than it seems. It's probably going to involve some unintuitive combos in other factions to really help increase the number of times we can target Hawkgirl and Hawkman with actions. And obviously, they won't be the only cards that we care about buffing in the deck. Steel's up next, and he's a 5/6 with guard. This is just good stats, man. Steel's a great card. I don't know what else to say, man. He's just got good stats. We talked about some of the ramp options we have in the deck. Being able to play this card on like turn 2, or even this plus another silver card on turn 3 is a huge deal. So I think this is a great combo card with Blue Devil. But other than that, all I have to say about this card is that it's a great defensive option. Courage. This is a big payoff for the 5 attack threshold deck. Your recruits with 5 attack or more are invincible this turn. Wow. I guess I'll mention this now because it's the time to mention this. I think if a card has shield and invincible, they won't lose shield if they otherwise would, because shield specifically reads when this card would receive damage, it instead loses shield. but Invincible reads that you don't receive damage or you cannot be KO'd during this turn. So I would never receive damage, so I shouldn't lose shield. At least that's my current interpretation. And if that's the case, Courage is even better than I initially thought. And if that's the case, Courage is absolutely a fantastic card. But even if that isn't the case, I think Courage is a fantastic card. I think that this card alone is enough to justify running Might and Tyranny together for the 5 attack threshold deck. We talked a little bit about that idea in the Tyranny video, but we needed a payoff to really justify that idea, and Courage, I think, is that payoff. Trial of the Amazons is up next, and honestly, I don't really see a use case for this card. It reads enemy recruits with 4 attack or less can't protect this turn. I just don't see a need for this card in this faction. This faction is very controlling and very mid-rangey. It has access to shield, so it has the ability to go for even trades, and even better than even trades. It also has the Courage card that we just went over. I don't see a scenario where my opponent puts a wall up in front of me of cards that are too strong for me to deal with, where I need to push past those and deal damage to the opponent leaders. Like, the situation just sounds so niche. Maybe if we're doing some type of weird Trial of the Amazons plus up and away combo, where we give all of our units with shield +4, and then we remove all of their protectors using Trial of Amazons, and then we just push for lethal. Maybe that's like the combo that they want us to go for here, but I'm not sure how strong that combo is, and I definitely don't think it justifies running Trial of the Amazons. I do see one case for Trial of the Amazons, and that's if I'm focusing the majority of my deck build on another faction, but I happen to be running Might as my secondary faction, and it's a super aggressive strategy. I could run Trial of the Amazon as a way to push for lethal in the final stages of the game. But typically when I do these review videos, I'm trying to focus the evaluation of the cards self-contained within their own faction, because that's the primary context that they have to be used in. Because even when you build a deck that features 20 cards from one faction and 20 cards from another faction, you still have to build like one half of the deck around the context of that faction, because you do need 19 or 18 other surrounding cards to combo with it. You can't just build an aggressive energy deck with 38 energy cards and 2 copies of Trial of Amazons. So that's why I try to just contain the analysis within the faction itself. Queen Hippolyta is up next. She's a 4/4 with Aura and Deploy. Give your recruits +1/+1. It's a strong effect. She's got pretty low stats though for a silver card. She does have Aura to kind of offset that a little bit, so she's a little bit protected than she otherwise would be. There's also, again, cards that care about having Aura. We talked about this early on in the video, but the best example of that is Mary Bromfield. Maybe there's some Mary Bromfield Queen Hippolyta deck that exists. It's 2 different buff cards or 2 different AoE buff cards, so maybe that is worth exploring once we get our hands on the game. But for now, I don't see a home for Queen Hippolyta inside of the Might faction itself. So the answer for what deck this belongs in is probably some type of multi-faction deck with some synergy across the 2 factions. 10th Metal is up next, and it's a really cool card. I like this card a lot. It just reads generate a gold resource. You can use this to play a gold card as early as turn 3, technically as early as turn 2. If you do Blue Devil on turn 1, that generates a silver resource for you on turn 2. You use that silver resource to play 10th Metal, and now you can play a golden card. It's definitely some potential right there. But even outside of that, even if you're doing this past turn 5, you can use this as a way to get access to 2 gold resources in a single turn, which is otherwise impossible. So this definitely belongs in some type of ramp strategy where you have a high ratio of golden cards in your deck, not only so you can play them earlier in the game than you otherwise would be able to, but also so you can play 2 of them in a single turn. Really, really cool card. It's the only card like this in the game. So I'll definitely be experimenting with this one a lot. Speaking of very unique cards, Lobo is a 6/6, and he reads Deploy. Secretly put a bounty on a random enemy character. After Lobo frags that bash, draw 2 cards, and they become free. Obviously, drawing 2 cards and turning them into a free card is very, very strong. The problem is, secretly putting a bounty on a random enemy character is a pretty weak effect, unless you high roll. And if you high roll, you probably instant win the game if you get Lobo to kill that card. Drawing 2 cards and making them free is huge. But if you hit an enemy character who currently has a ton of defense, like for example, one of their leaders, it's going to be pretty difficult to get off this effect. The nice thing is 6/6 is just pretty good stats anyway. So maybe we're just happy to play this card and know that a decent percentage of the time it's not going to get off its effect. But worst case scenario, we develop a 6/6. Actually, I might have just sold myself on Lobo. I was going to conclude this segment by saying I don't think Lobo's gonna see play or whatever, but honestly, don't we just jam him in the ramp deck and sometimes he goes crazy and sometimes he's just a 6/6. It's like whatever. It's like steal without guard kind of, which is fine because we can just put him in front of a target we want to protect. You know what? I actually like Lobo, man. I have Lobo faith. There's a couple questions though. We don't know for sure what secretly means. I assume secretly means that the opponent doesn't know who has the bounty, but we do know who the bounty has. But it's also possible that the player who plays Lobo doesn't even get to know who the bounty who the bounty belongs to. I also want to mention that you could potentially pair this with Batgirl to trigger this multiple times, and that way you could increase the chances of Lobo actually getting his effect off. But obviously that might be committing a little too hard to the Lobo effect. I'll be honest, this is like my 100th take of trying to read this card, so bear with me. My dyslexia will not fail me in this moment. Hammer Throw reads, deal damage to an enemy recruit equal to the attack of your highest attack recruit. Oh my god, you have no idea how many takes that took. Anyway, I think this card is a fantastic card. It's a great removal tool. A lot of your cards inside of the Might faction are going to have high attack values, whether you're playing a mid-range strategy, a ramp strategy, a buff strategy, a tempo strategy. Usually you're going to be able to take advantage of Hammer Throw. If you compare this to some of the other spot damage spells in the game, like for example, Energy Blast or Sonic Cannon or Whack-A-Man, really, Hammer Throw needs to just get 4 damage to be like a good card. You know what? I was just going to say I think this card's actually pretty weak in the early game, but I don't think it is. If it's turn 3 and the opponent's already had their turn 3, and we play like a bronze card, the bronze card that we play is probably strong enough to combo with Hammer Throw to at least clear something on the enemy board. So like you could use it as like a decent early tempo. I mean, obviously in that case it's trading down, so it's not great, right? You're using a silver resource card to kill what was probably a bronze resource card. But if you need to do it in like an emergency situation, then honestly, it's not too bad for you, right? Yeah, I'm pretty high on Hammer Throw. I like Hammer Throw a lot. Superboy is up next. Superboy is a 5/5 with shield. This is just a good card. I have nothing else to say about this card. It's just a good card. It reaches the 5 attack threshold for the 5 attack decks that care about that. It's a shield card, so it's great for the shield archetype. Yeah, Superboy is just great. I have nothing bad to say about Superboy. His stats are great. His effect is great. And he has a ton of synergy available to him across multiple different archetypes in the game. Down but not out. Down but not out reads, give your damaged characters shield. Even though this is a shield card, I think this is not something you probably run in the shield deck. The reason I don't think we run it in the shield deck is it's kind of like worse Krypto. Krypto reapplies shield to a card that doesn't have shield. But for down but not out, to give shield to a card that already had shield, the card would have to lose shield, then receive damage without dying to then give it shield. I think the real home for this is probably the buff deck. The buff deck is more likely to have its creatures survive attacks because obviously you've buffed them up with something like Thanagarian Mace or Super Strength, and then now that they've survived, you can give them shield either on the next turn or a part of that turn, and then go for another big trade now that you have shield on that card to kind of keep them alive for a longer period of time. So even though it's a little unintuitive to say that this doesn't belong in the shield deck, I think the real home for this is probably that kind of buff archetype with cards like Hawkgirl, Hawkman, and the Thanagarian Mace. This next card definitely belongs in shield though, and it's Kenan. He's got shield, and he's a 5/3. He reads, after a friendly recruit loses shield, give them +1/+1. I mean, yeah, what else is there to say? I mean, really, it is worth mentioning that Kong does only have 3 health, which is not great. 3 defense is definitely on the lower end. But if he loses his shield, which is already protecting him from the fact that he has such a low defense value, so really you have to kind of consider him at a 4 defense threshold. And then on top of that, he's also like buffing your smaller creatures. He buffs Krypto. He potentially buffs Superman Robot. I mean, yeah, he's great. He just belongs in the shield archetype. And then, of course, because his effect is so shield focused, you probably can't run him in non-shield decks, but I still think he's a great card. At first, honestly, I wasn't too impressed with Throne of Atlantis, but I think Throne of Atlantis is actually pretty good. The main reason it's good is because on turn 3, which is when we would otherwise be able to use Aquaman's effect, we have access to a silver resource and a bronze resource. So we can use Aquaman's effect to summon one of our sea creatures, then play Throne of Atlantis to create 2 sea creatures in our hand, and play one of those sea creatures with our leftover bronze resource. So we get to develop 2 sea creatures. They both get +1/+1 because of Aquaman's effect, and then you can play another sea creature the next turn alongside whatever silver card you have to play at that time. And it's just a way of getting out way more sea creatures than you would otherwise be able to. And even though you're committing an extra resource to it, it's offset by the fact that you're developing an extra sea creature that turn with the Aquaman effect itself. So honestly, I like Throne of Atlantis a lot, but if you asked me like 5 hours ago whether or not I liked Throne of Atlantis, I would have said that I think it's not that great. But I have come around. I think Throne of Atlantis is great. Metamorpho is a 3/3. He reads, after you play a recruit with 5 or more, Metamorpho gets +2/+2. So he's kind of another payoff card for the 5 attack threshold deck, and I think he's a pretty strong payoff for the 5 attack threshold deck, especially if you're playing this on the same turn that you're playing a 5 attack card. You can play this on the back row and then play the 5 attack card in front of this to kind of help protect it, and then try to scale this card even more by playing more and more 5 attack cards. But yeah, I think he's a good payoff card for the 5 attack threshold thing. Mera is up next, and Mera is a great card, man. She's a 3/7, so pretty good stats actually. The defense value is high, and that's really all that matters. A big fan of defense stats in this game. The first time you deploy a recruit with 5 or more attack, again, back to the 5 attack threshold, summon a tidal wave. You might be wondering what a tidal wave is. Thankfully, I've got the answers for you. Tidal wave is a 5/1 with speed and sacrifice Tidal Wave. So the main way you're going to be using this is trading into something, so to remove something. Worst case scenario, though, you just throw it onto an enemy leader for 5 damage. But really the exciting thing about this is it's essentially a double proc for all the cards that care about 5 attack cards being played. We just took a look at Metamorph. Obviously Black Adam belongs in the Anarchy faction. If you play Mera and then you play a 5 attack card, not only are you giving a proc from the initial 5 attack card you played, but you're also giving one for Tidal Wave as well. Oh, actually, I made a mistake just now. Metamorph would not get buffed by Tidal Wave because Metamorph specifically says play, not when you deploy. So Metamorph would not receive a buff from Tidal Wave, but Black Adam would. Either way, I think Mera is a great payoff card for the 5 attack threshold deck, especially considering some of the other payoffs we've already gone over in this video. Courage being one, and the Aquaman pool of cards being one. Yeah, really, really cool. Yeah, lots of synergy there. It is worth mentioning, though, that, of course, Mera is an ultimate card, so you can only run one copy of this card, but still a great card nonetheless. I'm not sure how to pronounce this card, so I'm not going to try and butcher it, but it is a 1/6 with start, seek a divine weapon. What are divine weapons? There are 3 of them, and here they are. The Gauntlets of Atlas reads double the attack of a friendly recruit. The Sunblade reads give a friendly recruit +1 and start, generate a gold resource. That's a very scary effect. And Shield of the Gods, double the defense of a friendly recruit. It's interesting that this is Seek, so you'll never be put in a situation where you get one of these and don't want them because you get to manually select these. I think the idea they're trying to push is that you run this in the buff deck, the type of deck we were talking about before with like Hawkman and Hawkgirl. But is it too slow for that archetype? It's hard to say. The main problem is it's got a conflicting cost with Hawkman and Hawkgirl. Obviously, you don't have them in your hand. It's not applicable, but if you do have them all in your hand, I don't see a world where you're not playing Hawkman or Hawkgirl over playing this card. But obviously, he's got a big upside. It is worth noting that this is the only way to generate these divine weapon cards so far. So if you do want access to the divine weapons, that's the only way you can do it. All right, we can finally move on to golden cards. We'll start off with Yara Flor. I believe I'm Flor. I feel like I'm butchering that name, but perhaps not. She's a 5/5 with Aura, so that's already off to a good start, but I mean, it's a gold card, so it's pretty expensive. But that's okay, because reduce Yara's cost for each friendly recruit with 5 attack or more. That means if you have 3 of them in play, she's just a free card. There's 2 main thresholds we care about for the reduction here. We care about it going down to silver, and we care about it going down to free. Past turn 3, there's not a huge difference between a silver and bronze card. So as long as Yara is getting reduced by 1, that's good for us, and then it's really good for us if she's getting reduced by 3, because then of course she's completely free and we're not spending any resources on her. Yeah, I like Yara a lot. She's a good payoff for not only the 5 attack threshold decks, but just like ramp decks or anything where you can reasonably expect to be playing relatively strong cards. Aquaman's up next. Oh my god, I love this card. This is so cool. Aquaman has +2 for each of your sea creatures. Honestly, I don't think that effect is too important. The big important part is the fact that he's a 3/9, so he's nice and defensive, and he reads start. Summon a sea creature. You just get a free sea creature every turn. It is worth mentioning that random summon effects like this, including the Aquaman effect, which I guess I should have mentioned when we were talking about the Aquaman leader, these will summon in random locations. So you can't choose where to put these cards, but hey, how can you complain about getting a free sea creature? I mean, obviously this is quite a slow effect. Obviously you have to play the Aquaman on turn 5. You have to wait a turn to get your sea creature, but really, if you get him to stick around, you should be absolutely in a winning position. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Aquaman. Man, these shield cards are crazy. Let's go Supergirl first. Supergirl reads shield deploy, give another friendly recruit with shield +5/+5. We've already gone over some really powerful shield cards. Giving them +5/+5 is going to be no joke. Supergirl's a great card. Even though she's a gold card, I think she's a fantastic payoff for the shield package, and I expect her to see play in those decks. Another card that I expect to see play in those decks is Power Girl. Man, this card's insane. Shield, after a friendly character loses shield on your turn, give them shield. So during your turn, it essentially says that your cards cannot lose shield, which at that point, they might as well just read shield are invincible. Yeah, I mean this is just good. I don't have anything else to say other than this card is just good. Just in case it's not 100% clear, this won't apply during the opponent's turn. So obviously they can kill off your shields during their turn, and then you won't get value out of Power Girl's effect. But if they spend a turn removing all of your shield effects, they're gonna have a hard time of actually dealing with your board. Yeah, Power Girl is pretty scary, I'm not gonna lie. Very fun card. Expect to see it see a ton of play, I think. Wonder Woman's up next, and I like this effect a lot, man. She's a 6/6 with Aura. Deploy, give your adjacent might characters. So this can apply to leaders +2/+2. I'm not 100% sure what adjacent means. Like, adjacent in theory could just go vertically, or it could just go horizontally, or it could go in both directions, both horizontally and vertically. I guess even technically it could go diagonally, but I don't think it'll do that. So really, the ideal situation for this is that you play a card in the front row in the center, and then you play Wonder Woman behind it to give both of your leaders +2/+2, and then also give the card in front of her +2/+2. Ideally, that card would be something with guard, so maybe like steel. Yeah, man, I just like this effect a lot. I think it's really cool. It's also encouragement for running mono might. Because if your other leader is not a might card, it won't receive the +2/+2. But yeah, in general, I like this card. Nubia is up next. She's a 7/7 with aura. It's kind of like a vanilla card. There is another vanilla card here in the Might faction that we'll go over here. But yeah, honestly, I don't know if this card's worth running. For a gold cost card, it's really its biggest upside is that it's aura. Maybe it's worth running in that kind of aura package we talked about earlier that we have to splash into the energy faction for. Yeah, maybe I'm sleeping on this card. This actually might be better than I'm initially thinking, but my initial take is that it's not great. Highfather's up next. I love this card, man. This card's great. It's a 12/12, so insane stat line, and it reads aura as an additional cost to play Highfather, pay a silver. So it's a gold silver card, so that means you're only able to play this on turn 5 unless you do some 10th metal synergy. You could do 10th metal on turn 4, sacrificing one of your silver resources to generate a gold resource, and then you'll have a gold and a silver, and you'll use the gold and the silver to play Highfather. So technically you can play this as soon as turn 4, which I guess means technically you could play it as soon as turn 3 if you use Blue Devil on turn 2, then have 2 silver resources on turn 3, and then use 10th metal to take one of those silver resources and turn them into a gold resource, and then play Highfather on turn 3 and still have a bronze resource left over. Obviously that's very situational, but I like this card a lot and it's really cool. Another big card for the potential ramp package is Swamp Thing. He's got low stats, he's a 2/5, but his effect makes up for it. He's got guard, so that's nice. And then it reads deploy, Swamp Thing gets +2/+2 for each enemy recruit. Again, I think this belongs in like ramp packages similar to the Highfather. The main reason for that is because often in ramp strategies you'll be giving up board control in favor of scaling your resources so that you can play bigger cards in the future. So the opponent's likely to have a higher recruit count than they normally would. So in theory, Swamp Thing scales up better in that type of deck than he otherwise normally would. But he's also kind of just good, so maybe he sees play outside of those kind of ramp packages. Superman's up next. Superman is an 8/8 with shield. While Superman is in your front row, your leaders are invincible. Potentially a good pairing with something like the Flash, who gets access to like 4 attack value, which is really good. The only problem with it is that he has to take a lot of damage to get that damage on the board. But if you play Superman alongside a flash effect, then of course he's not going to be receiving any damage. There are easier ways to do that, but it's a potential synergy that I thought at least it was worth mentioning. It's also worth mentioning that this is an ultimate card, so you can only play 1 copy of this in your deck, and it's obviously got synergy with all of the shield-oriented cards in the game, but I don't think you need to run this in a shield deck. This is just a good card, I think. If you're going to be running lots of gold cards, you might as well splash in Superman. Yeah, I mean, what else can I say? It's just a solid card. Big Barda's up next. She's a 6/10, so very defensive card. This is probably one of the better vanilla creatures, actually. 10 defense is so much. I just don't know if vanilla creatures will find that, or vanilla recruits. Sorry, I keep saying creatures. I don't know if, probably because I'm thinking of sea creatures, man. Yeah, I don't know if vanilla cards are going to make their way into super optimized decks, but if they do, Big Barda is probably on the short list for those cards that will make their way, because, I mean, 6/10 is just good stats. Truth and Justice. Give your characters +2/+2. I was previously really high on this card, but your leaders do not give retaliate damage during the opponent's turn. So your leaders always effectively have 0 attack value during your opponent's turn. So that makes cards like Truth and Justice and cards that give permanent attack to your leaders a little bit worse than they otherwise would be. But I still think Truth and Justice is a great card. Maybe there's a deck where we go Wonder Woman, Truth and Justice, and the Flash, and we just try to go crazy and give all of our leaders all these attack values, and then just constantly be attacking with them. And then obviously with the Flash, we can attack twice with them. So there's definitely potential synergy there. Who knows how good that is? My expectation is that it's not great, but in games where it hits, it's going to feel really dominant. The problem is you probably just give up too much tempo trying for an effect like this. There's also a world where you just go less memey with this and you just focus on giving this to recruits. Obviously, it's nice that it hits leaders as well, but maybe you just jam this into like a mid-rangey deck. Maybe you just jam it into the shield deck. Maybe you jam it into the buff deck. Obviously, it applies buffs to both Hawkman and Hawkgirl, which can be a big deal. Yeah, honestly, I've kind of convinced myself. I went a full circle in that explanation. At first I was like, it's kind of a shame I don't get my cool retaliate thing that I thought would be possible, and then I kind of convinced myself all the way back around that maybe it's just a good global buff card anyway. Or I guess area of effect buff card, not global. Dual Force. Hey, they said the name of the game in the game. How cool is that? Charge your leaders twice. This is the fastest charge effect we've seen in the game, with the exception of Boxing Glove, which is a token generated by Green Arrow and Speedy. Charging your leaders twice is huge. Definitely has some potential. Maybe you jam this in the 5 attack threshold deck, so that you could charge your Black Adam a little bit faster, maybe get off Black Adam's effect as soon as turn 5. Hitting Black Adam's effect early is really important because his plus 10 attack is permanent. It does not go away at the end of the turn, so maybe something like that with Dual Force is the way to go. But really, just using this on literally any leader is fantastic. Any deck that can get away with running multiple gold cards probably wants to run Dual Force, I think. Dual Force is... Dude, I'm so convinced that charging your leaders is really good in this game, by the way. And Dual Force is potentially quite a big part of that. Again, the only problem is that the big reason I think charging is so good is for that early game tempo swing, but this is a gold card. So, you know, the early game is well and truly gone. Hurl into the Stratosphere. Put an enemy recruit into your opponent's deck. So it's kind of like a sap or a bounce effect, but it goes into the opponent's deck, meaning that they have to wait to draw it again. It technically makes them drawing cards a little less consistent, but I mean, really, it's just a removal tool. You can treat this as KO an enemy recruit in most situations. Obviously, there's like really bad situations where it's a really important card and you need to get rid of it, and then you played this, and then they still top deck the card out of some crazy amazing luck. But excluding that scenario, this is effectively just KO an enemy recruit. So yeah, solid removal tool. Oh, somehow I managed to miss a bronze card. So we're going to quickly jump back into bronze and focus on Lasso of Truth for a moment. Lasso of Truth reads move an enemy recruit and exhaust it. Lasso of Truth is in an awkward position for me because both sides of its effect aren't good enough to run in a deck, in my opinion. Moving an enemy recruit just attached to a bronze action, that's probably not worth running. Exhausting an enemy recruit is also probably not worth running on a bronze cost card. So hopefully these two effects combined together are enough to justify a bronze cost card in your deck. Personally, I don't think they're going to be, especially not in like a might deck. We talked a little bit about the idea of some cards being evaluated a little inaccurately when we talk about them in this context because we're very focused on this faction. But there's a chance that if there is an aggressive might deck that can exist, Lasso of Truth can take advantage of it because it acts as almost like a finisher. Move this card out of the way. Now I can attack your leader directly and deal a ton of damage to them. I'm still not even sure if it's worth a deck slot in those types of decks because those types of decks want to be able to tempo out and curve out very aggressively. If they draw this card in the early game, it's just like a dead card in their hand that they can't use. Is it worth running for the occasional top deck to close out the game in some type of might aggro hybrid list? Personally, I don't see it, but there is a chance. Lead from the front. Give a friendly leader +5 attack this turn and swap them to the space in front of them. This is potentially a finisher for Flash archetypes, right? You go Flash, you use his ability, you use lead from the front. Now you have a 7 attack Flash with Flurry, and then there's of course other ways to give Flash even more attack. I don't think that's going to be the answer, and it's interesting that you can move your leader to the front space. The only other example of that in the game right now is Bizarro. I don't see this one seeing play. There's probably better finishers for you to run in most cases. There's an interesting combo with this and Superman though. You get his attack to 12, so he can actually just kill anything in the game. Again, with the exception of anything with shield. So I guess that's a bit of a combo. You spend 3 energy and a gold cost card to kill anything on the enemy's board. Personally, I'm not sold. Super Size is super fun. It reads double a friendly recruit's attack and defense plus draw a card. I am super down for this card. This is awesome. It works as a finisher in kind of like mid-rangey style decks. It acts as like a support card in certain ramp strategies. If you get out like a big Swamp Thing or a big Highfather, you can always play Super Size on top of it and get it gigantic. Plus you draw a card to potentially use as your silver card for that turn. Yeah, I like Super Size a lot. Very cool card. The only thing up in the air about Super Size right now is how viable really slow, control-y, greedy decks are going to be. And that's to be determined. The final card we're going to go over today and the final card we're going to go over for any of the review videos. Actually, that's not true. I've got a smaller video I need to do on the energy faction, but this is effectively the closing ceremony for the faction reviews. It's Unexpected Help. Unexpected Help reads, if you have fewer than 2 leaders, summon a might, energy, or tactics leader. They have 10 defense and 3 charges. So we've gone over all of the leaders in other videos, but let me just have a slide for you to show you them all. This really sucks if you hit Cyborg because he's the only one of these leaders who will not be able to use their effect on the turn that they're played. With that said, if he survives, he should be able to get off at some crazy powerful effect because by this point in the game where one of your leaders has already died and you're in the position where you can play Unexpected Hero, Cyborg's probably going to be doing quite a lot of damage with his effect. As for the other leaders, most of them have really huge tempo swings the turn that you summon them with Unexpected Hero. Batgirl has the potential of triggering a deploy effect. Batman has the potential of giving you a really important gadget in that particular situation. Similar things can be said for Green Arrow. How Jordan can generate a bronze resource, which after having just spent a golden one can be pretty important as well. Shazam being able to attack for 5 is a big deal, assuming that they don't enter play exhausted. I assume they don't enter play exhausted because I don't think leaders unless a card says, exhaust a leader. I don't think leaders have like summoning sickness. Zatanna has the ability to get you a really important magical spell. There are a lot of really good magical spells, by the way. Superman has the ability to just KO something on the enemy board. Wonder Woman has a really powerful attack value already. We've talked about that. And Aquaman, if you're already running Aquaman, you have some crazy potential with Unexpected Hero. But even if you're not already running Aquaman, Aquaman could summon in a very clutch sea creature, something like Storm of the Seahorse, or Squid is a potentially really clutch card as well. All of that is to say that Unexpected Help's really nice because it has the potential to really clutch up the game, not only essentially because you're healing 10 defense, right? You're putting an extra leader in play, but that leader has the ability to resolve their effect the turn that they're played. Again, all of this is assuming that they don't enter with some type of summoning sickness. Again, I don't think leaders have summoning sickness. I could be wrong about that. I really hope I'm not, because Unexpected Help gets a lot worse if that leader can't attack the turn it comes into play, because most of these cards have some type of attack that they want to do when they enter play. All right, that's going to close out the Might faction video. The recording for this file is the longest of any file I've had so far, so hopefully the video is not like 3 hours long. It can't be 3 hours long. The recording for this was an hour and 18 minutes. I hope you enjoyed. I'll be back tomorrow with a smaller review. I just want to talk about some energy cards that we missed out on our first review. And we're closing in on streamer beta weekend, which is really exciting. I'll be trying out a ton of decks during that weekend. But I'm signing out there. Keep being awesome, and I'll catch you in the next one.